The rain had begun as a quiet drizzle, but soon it turned into a relentless downpour, drumming against the windows of the opulent mansion like 1,000 tiny hammers. In the sprawling backyard, under the skeletal shade of an old oak tree, stood the black maid Maria, her thin dress clinging to her small frame, soaked to the skin. In her hands, she held a small, tattered lunchbox, its contents modest: a few pieces of bread, a slice of cheese, and a cup of lukewarm soup that she had hurriedly packed before the morning rush began. She crouched on the cold, muddy ground, ignoring the mud that seeped into her worn shoes, focusing entirely on the meal she barely had time to savor. It was a scene so ordinary and yet so human, one that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else in the city. But for Edward Langston, the billionaire whose private jet flew across continents as casually as some took taxis, it was a moment that pierced the walls he had built around himself for decades. He had always thought of life as a series of investments and returns, of numbers and deals, a world in which emotions were luxuries, and empathy was a liability. Yet, from his office window on the top floor of the mansion, he found himself frozen, staring at Maria with a curious, unfamiliar sensation welling in his chest. The rain blurred the outline of her figure, yet every detail, the careful way she tore the bread, the delicate lift of the soup cup to her lips, the occasional glance at the sky as if praying silently for the storm to cease, etched itself into his mind. It was not merely that she was eating in the rain. It was the dignity with which she persisted, the resilience that shone even in such a humble, overlooked act, that made Edward feel the stirrings of something long dormant. He felt an urge to rush outside, to hand her an umbrella, to offer something, anything, that would ease her discomfort. But more than that, he felt a pang of shame, a realization that his life of luxury had always shielded him from understanding the quiet struggles of those who served him day after day. In that single simple act of eating while drenched and muddy, Maria had, unknowingly, pierced the armor of detachment Edward had cultivated over a lifetime. He watched as a few droplets of soup slipped from the cup and hit the muddy ground, and without conscious thought, he imagined a world where no one had to eat alone in the rain, where no one had to endure life's little indignities in silence. The scene was a mirror, reflecting not only her struggle but also his own emotional barrenness. That morning, for the first time in decades, Edward felt the tug of genuine human connection, a recognition that the world was not just a ledger of gains and losses, but a tapestry of human experiences, each thread deserving attention and care. By the time Edward had descended the grand staircase, dripping in silk and cashmere, Maria had begun to eat more hurriedly, her hunger overtaking her discomfort. He reached her just as she was scooping up the last remnants of soup, and without thinking, he handed her the large umbrella he had brought from the house entrance. "Here, take this," he said, his voice unusually soft, unpracticed in human warmth. Maria froze, looking up at him with wide, incredulous eyes, as if she could not reconcile the imposing figure of the man she served with this act of unexpected kindness. In her world, Edward Langston was a distant, untouchable entity, whose presence was felt in orders, schedules, and whispered instructions, not in moments of empathy. Yet here he was, standing in the rain, drenched himself, offering protection from the very element that had soaked her fragile frame. She hesitated, then, slowly, accepted the umbrella, gripping it with trembling hands. In that instant, the air seemed to shift. The rain no longer felt like an adversary but like a backdrop to something transformative, a silent witness to the birth of a human connection neither of them had anticipated. Edward noticed the way her eyes softened, the subtle curve of a grateful smile forming, and he felt a warmth that no sum of money or luxury could ever replicate. The sight of her eating, resilient yet unprotected, had stirred a recognition of the fundamental humanity they shared, regardless of status or race. And as she tucked the lunchbox under the protective canopy of the umbrella, Edward realized that his previous understanding of generosity had been transactional at best. A donation here, a charity there, always carefully calculated to bolster his image rather than touch a life. This moment was raw, unmediated, a reminder that true compassion required no agenda, only presence. He guided her toward the mansion, insisting she come inside and warm herself, and she obeyed, her steps tentative yet hopeful. Along the way, Edward felt a curious mix of embarrassment and revelation. embarrassed at the years of emotional detachment he had cultivated, and exhilarated at the possibility that it was not too late to change. In helping her, he had begun to dismantle the fortress of indifference around his heart, brick by brick, realizing that even the smallest acts of consideration could ripple far beyond a single moment. Maria, on her part, was silent, yet every gesture, clutching the umbrella, straightening her soaked dress, looking back at him with cautious trust, spoke volumes. Edward understood then that wealth, influence, and power were meaningless if they did not connect to the lives of real people, to their struggles, their triumphs, their daily acts of courage that often went unseen. Once inside the warm, lavish kitchen, Maria set the lunchbox down, still gripping the umbrella as though it were a talisman against the storm outside. Edward fetched a towel and gently handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers in a fleeting but grounding human contact. The richness of the kitchen, the gleaming marble countertops, the delicate aroma of freshly baked pastries, the soft hum of an industrial espresso machine, contrasted starkly with the modest meal she had brought, and yet the disparity no longer mattered in the same way it had before. Edward felt a sudden urgency to understand her world, to see life through the lens of someone who labored quietly, whose existence had been defined by service rather than command. He offered her a seat and poured a fresh cup of warm tea, watching as she accepted it with a humility that made him question everything he had known about hierarchy and worth. As Maria sipped, Edward sat across from her, not as a billionaire to a maid, but as a fellow human being sharing a moment of understanding. Conversation flowed awkwardly at first, filled with polite hesitations, but soon, stories emerged. Her childhood in a small rural village, the sacrifices her parents had made, the daily trials of living in a city that often ignored people like her. Edward listened, truly listened, and found himself struck by the resilience, the quiet dignity, and the understated wisdom in her words. Each anecdote revealed a world he had never truly seen, a mosaic of struggle and hope, of challenges met with courage, of small joys cherished despite hardship. And in that listening, he began to recognize his own failings. The years spent pursuing wealth at the expense of empathy, the relationships neglected, the humanity sidelined for ambition. There was a humility in Maria's presence, a natural grace that contrasted sharply with the cultivated sophistication of Edward's social circles, and it was precisely this authenticity that shook him to the core. The realization came in a slow, undeniable wave. Wealth was not a measure of human greatness. Compassion was. The ability to see another person, to honor their existence, to respond to their needs without expectation, was the truest currency of life. By simply being present, offering a towel, tea, and shelter from the rain, Edward had begun a transformation that no boardroom, no bank account, and no title could ever inspire. And Maria, unknowingly, had become the catalyst for this awakening, her humble lunch in the rain a mirror reflecting not just her struggle, but the deep emptiness he had allowed to fester within himself for decades. By the time the rain eased into a gentle drizzle, the mansion had grown quiet again, but inside, a remarkable change had taken root. Edward and Maria sat together, the remains of her simple meal now gone, and yet the conversation had left a richer feast of understanding and connection in its place. Edward realized that his life, so meticulously curated to reflect success and sophistication, had lacked the most elemental human experience, genuine care for another soul. The sight of her, hunched against the rain, determined to eat despite discomfort, had ignited a profound sense of empathy that he could not ignore. He offered to make her a proper meal, insisting she stay longer, and she hesitated, unused to such attention, but the sincerity in his voice dissolved her hesitation. As he cooked, an act so foreign to him yet so grounding, Edward noticed the joy in her eyes, a quiet radiance that had nothing to do with his wealth and everything to do with acknowledgement and respect. In that small kitchen, amidst the aroma of cooking, the patter of rain on the roof, and the warmth of shared human presence, Edward experienced a revelation. Wealth could buy comfort and luxury, but it could never purchase connection, humility, or the raw beauty of human kindness. And Maria, in her simple act of eating lunch in the rain, had reminded him of that most fundamental truth. From that day forward, Edward Langston began to live differently. He walked the halls of his mansion not as an untouchable tycoon but as a man awakened, one who understood that true greatness lay in the small gestures of care, in noticing what others endured, in choosing empathy over indifference. The memory of Maria in the rain remained etched in his mind, a permanent marker of the day he rediscovered his humanity, and he knew that no fortune, however vast, could ever outweigh the lessons learned from that quiet, extraordinary moment.